You ever seen 200,000 parked right in the front? You ever seen 3 shots pulled up in 1 cup? I like luxury, fast cars, and whip that jump. I like my money sack fat like Professor Clump. And my funds large and my flow dumb hard. I'm a murder case, you chumps just a gun charge.